In the 1920s, there was an actress who made her way to the top of Hollywood without even really trying, then rejected it once she got there. Despite not being one of the top actresses in terms of popularity, she became one of the most influential in film history, and moreover, she was a fashion icon. She didn't make many films, but yet her legacy remains strong even to this day. You've already seen the title of this video, so of course I'm talking about the one and only Louise Brooks. Mary Louise Brooks was born on November 14, 1906, in the fairly small town of Cherryville, Kansas. Her parents were hands-off, to say the least. For example, as Louise wrote in an autobiographical essay, "At the dinner table once, when my brother Martin confessed to having thrown me down the steep back stairs, Father suggested that next time it would be safer to throw me down the first landing of the U-shaped front stairs." Louise's mother, Myra, had married Louise's father with the stipulation that she wouldn't go out of her way to take care of children should they have any. He agreed, and they proceeded to have 4 children. And she kept her promise, being very passive toward Louise and her siblings, occasionally indulging them in worthwhile pursuits and other times ignoring them. Louise later gave credit to her mother for introducing her to reading, which became a lifelong hobby for Louise. But overall, Myra was more interested in pursuing her own hobbies than raising children. When Louise was 9 years old, she was touched by a local middle-aged man, then had a similar experience with a different man 5 years later. These experiences had the effect of distorting the meaning of love and sex when she became an adult. Louise began to dance at a young age, and by the age of 10, she was performing for audiences at various local places. At one point, her mother decided her daughter needed a new look for her performances, so she cut her long hair down to a short length all around. This was a bit ahead of the curve considering this was only around 1917, but Louise would maintain this bobbed hairstyle in one form or another all the way through the 1920s. In 1919, Louise and her family moved to another Kansas town, Independence, then to Wichita the next year. Louise also became interested in movies from an early age, even writing mini reviews in her diary beginning in 1921. She cited Rudolph Valentino in her diary as her favorite actor at the time. Louise had a reputation for being rambunctious, rebellious, and hot-tempered, especially with one of her brothers, and had a strained relationship with her mother. By all accounts, Louise was very popular among the boys for her good looks when she entered high school. And while she was interested in boys, she didn't really develop any serious relationships, going in and out of short ones instead. In 1922, after seeing a theatrical dance performance by the famous dancer Denishawn with her mother, the two of them went backstage to meet Sean. Sean very quickly offered to enroll Mary Louise in his Denishawn dance school in New York City. Her mother agreed on the condition that a responsible woman live with and watch over her daughter. Then Myra and Louise eventually got Louise's father to agree, and off she went to the big city, the first step towards a career in performing, where she earned $40 a week. So she trained and trained in New York, learning the newest developments in modern dance. She flourished at the school, and so often stuck out from the other girls because of her beauty and deep, dark eyes. After 2 months, the school's training finished, and she was offered a job at the dance company, and traveled around the country performing. But it wasn't always as glamorous as it sounded. She performed with her fellow dancers mostly in smaller towns and cities, staying in cheap hotels. But sometimes they had better luck. In general, the good outweighed the bad for her. Around this time, Louise dropped her first name, Mary, and began going by Louise. Denishawn was run by Denishawn and his wife, Ruth St. Denis. The couple made strict rules for the behavior and morals of their performers. Even though Louise was one of the star newcomers, she struggled to toe the line with the rules. She was still very young and full of energy, and it was difficult for her to not break curfew. Around this same time, Louise spent a summer at Mariarden, a dance and theater training camp that included Denishawn as the dance instructor. Here, Louise became friends with the future short-lived actress Barbara Bennett, who was the sister of the future actresses Constance and Joan Bennett. During the 1923 to 1924 season, when Louise, aged 15 or 16, was traveling around the US, she may have slept with a freelance publicist who followed the troupe around. It was rumored among the other members that she had slept with other men as well. Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn began to accompany her on occasion after hearing these rumors. And Louise received more and more prominent roles in the exotic shows that Denishawn put on. She certainly realized that it was something very different, but perhaps didn't yet realize that what she was participating in would be a big influence on the art of modern dance. Keep in mind that these shows weren't just popular entertainment like vaudeville, but very ambitious, artistic dance performances, the likes of which had rarely been experienced before, at least not in America. But Louise's part in the shows were not to last. One day, Louise came in late to a small assembly. Her attitude, this time as well as previously, apparently did not sit well with Ruth St. Denis, who dismissed Louise from the company then and there, saying, according to Louise's recollection, "I am dismissing you from the company because you want life handed to you on a silver salver." Louise had been a talented dancer, and Ruth St. Denis knew that, but she lacked personal discipline, and that was unacceptable for Denishawn. Louise lived with Barbara Bennett and her family in the following months, her confidence in her abilities shaken and not wanting to return to Kansas. Though, according to Louise, only 1 hour after leaving Denishawn, she and Barbara were walking along Broadway when Barbara saw a booking agent she knew, and immediately got Louise a job in George White's Scandals, which was a competitor to the famous stage show The Ziegfeld Follies. The fact that she was the only chorus girl who was a trained dancer in addition to being stunningly beautiful made her the envy of the other dancers in the Scandals. As she became more recognized, she was naturally guided toward the glamorous life of show business, receiving expensive gifts from rich men trying to woo the chorus girls, and taking them to high society dances and banquets. Even by this time, Louise had no ambition to be a film actress, and still wanted to continue dancing. She even turned down a screen test in 1924. Scandals was an extravagant production, with the added bonus of beautiful and rather scantily clad women. Apparently, Louise felt liberated by this. While living in New York, she was kicked out of 2 hotels for wearing clothing that was too provocative. Not long after these incidents, Barbara Bennett's parents had decided to send their daughter to a private school in Paris. Louise would follow her, abruptly quitting her job with the Scandals. Shortly after they arrived in Paris, however, Barbara decided to go back to New York, but for whatever reason, Louise stayed. But she was isolated in a foreign country, knowing none of the native language. Lucky yet again, an American stage producer named Archie Selwyn noticed her, and she explained her situation. He got her a job dancing the Charleston in London, which apparently made her the first person to perform the dance in England. She had only recently learned it when she had been in New York. Eventually, Louise too would return to New York. Upon her return, she was approached by Florenz Ziegfeld, who offered her a job in one of his shows outside of the Follies called Louis XIV after seeing the impression she had made in the Scandals. The show proved to be a big success, and Florenz Ziegfeld moved Louise to the big time, the Follies. It was after her summer performance with the Follies in 1925 that, for the first time, she was mentioned by name in a newspaper review. She was singled out for her solo dancing, and especially for her irresistible bobbed hair. Despite this promotion that most other chorus girls would give anything for, Louise thought that the Follies' dances were boring compared with the super serious and artistic Denishawn dances. She genuinely was interested in the art of dancing, not just the fame and attention gained from doing stage shows. In that same vein, she also had an appetite for other art. She enjoyed quote-unquote real literature as opposed to the lowbrow magazines like the ones the other chorus girls read. There are a couple of anecdotes from this time that show 2 sides of Louise. She once skipped a Follies performance in order to see the much-hyped musical No No Nanette with Herman Mankiewicz, who was then a drama critic for the New York Times. He was so excited that he was taking such a beautiful woman to a great show that he drank way too much before the show and passed out asleep during the performance. Instead, Louise jotted down some notes and wrote the review for him, showing off her learnedness. Another time, during a Follies show, famous comedian Will Rogers made an unscripted move when, getting to the top of some stairs lined with Follies girls, he took out his chewing gum and stuck it to the end of Louise's nose. Backstage, she flew into a rage and threatened to kill him. Louise lived above her means in New York City. Many of the chorus girls did. For the most popular ones, their salaries were steadily supplemented by fur coats and expensive jewelry from male admirers. And Louise was just as prone to the nightlife of New York as any other 18-year-old girl would have been at the time. In fact, she really lived a glorified 1920s lifestyle, going to the best speakeasies in the city, dancing the Charleston, and living in the luxurious though seedy world of show business. Like a number of others in the world of stage shows, Louise considered films to be beneath stage performances in terms of artistic value. But fate had other plans for her. Louise only did a screen test because her friend and lover, Walter Wanger, had lavished her with gifts, and that finally persuaded her. She didn't think her short performance was good, though others, the director Herbert Brennan among them, disagreed. She never pursued a movie career, probably much to the jealousy of thousands of extra girls who couldn't make it in the industry no matter how hard they tried. But Louise's small bit part had not gone unnoticed. When she was offered 2 5-year contracts from MGM and Paramount, she went back to Walter Wanger for help. Even though he worked for Paramount, he recommended that Louise take the MGM contract, saying that if she became successful at Paramount, people would assume it was because she was sleeping with him, which wasn't the case at all. Louise thought that he was implying she lacked talent, so she took the Paramount contract. As was common for someone in her position at the time, the 18-year-old Louise had a number of romantic encounters with men in show business, including a 2-month-long one with Charlie Chaplin, fresh off his success from his film The Gold Rush. Her next film would be The American Venus in 1926, where she got more than just a bit part, and her name was included in the credits. It's now a lost film, however, the trailer has survived, as well as 3 seconds of Technicolor footage from the film that was only found in 2018. This is the only surviving color footage of Louise's film career. The American Venus was essentially an unabashed glorification of feminine beauty that had been utilized in the trend of beauty pageants. During filming for The American Venus, Louise would often take naps all around the building. She was still doing folly shows at night, so her schedule was all over the place, and she snatched little bits of sleep when she could. Before the release of her second film, however, Louise found herself in a minor scandal. She filed a lawsuit against a famous art photographer in an attempt to stop him from publishing a series of nude photos she had agreed to do a short time ago. She said she had thought it would help her achieve a higher status in the entertainment world, and now she didn't want them to be seen by the public now that she was becoming more famous. Despite the photographer's insistence on the photo's status as art, he did not release them. While Louise's third film, A Social Celebrity from 1926, is lost, we do know one thing. This was when her image as a flapper was beginning to become her main screen persona. Colleen Moore had really jump-started the obsession with screen flappers with her starring role in Flaming Youth, though had not invented the bob as some were alleging. Then along came Clara Bow, another flapper, and was one of the greatest possessors of it, according to many commentators. And shortly, a new contender would arrive in the form of Joan Crawford. Louise Brooks had everything that was necessary to fulfill the role of a flapper on film. She already practically lived like one anyway. She had bobbed hair, which she had had since she was a child, she had a spunky and energetic screen personality, and she absolutely had it. But she hadn't quite had her breakthrough film yet. She was only making $250 a week at this point. This wasn't a measly sum for a job at the time, but compare that to Clara Bow's $7,500 and Colleen Moore's $12,500. But Colleen Moore had her role in Flaming Youth, and Clara Bow would soon solidify her status with the 1927 movie Wings. Louise's fourth film, It's the Old Army Game, in 1926, saw her starring alongside the comedian and her friend W.C. Fields, who she had previously worked with in the Ziegfeld Follies. But this was far from a breakthrough role, since most of the focus was on the main comedian, Fields. The director of the movie, the young A. Edward Sutherland, was so stricken with Louise that he showered her with attention after the film was finished. But Louise brushed him aside for now to focus on more films. But not long into the filming of her new movie, she casually decided to marry Sutherland. Equally as flippant, Louise broke the news to the director of a film she was appearing in by casually saying, "I'd like a little time off today. I want to get married." Louise's apparent disinterest and Sutherland's previous quick marriage that ended in divorce didn't bode well for the married couple. Their marriage was rough from the start. They rarely even saw each other in the first 6 months and had long periods of separation after that, staying together only about 2 weeks at the longest, and they both had affairs. 2 films later, though still in 1926, Louise's film Love 'Em and Leave 'Em pushed her further into the flapper category. And despite her character being unlikable, Louise received much of the attention from the film, and she was predicted to be a big star in the future in the newspaper reviews. By the end of 1926, Louise had been in 7 films, and though she had proved to be a rising beauty, she had still not had her breakthrough, and this would continue into 1927. But her acting technique had certainly improved, and she knew it. Her status as a beautiful, modern woman with style had pretty much been achieved, and her brief change to a non-bobbed hairstyle didn't go unnoticed in the movie magazines. So really, she was still more or less eye candy for the big screen, though she was certainly showing potential to surpass that view. At the beginning of 1927, Paramount had closed down its Astoria studio in New York in favor of a bigger studio in Hollywood, one of the dying breaths of the West Coast film industry, at least for the moment. Louise would always prefer the West Coast and disdained Hollywood, partly because the industry people there were less intellectual and therefore, for her, less interesting. She was still cast in more mid-tier comedies in a supporting role. Excluding her extra bit in her first film, by this point she had only appeared in movies that were at least partly comedies. But things changed a little bit in 1927 when she was cast in a dramatic role in the gangster film The City Gone Wild. But because this movie is also lost, we'll probably never see how she handled the transition. That same year, Louise became annoyed that her mother, who she had not kept in touch with, was trying to capitalize on her fame. Myra had also all but abandoned Louise's 12-year-old sister, June. So Louise brought June to New York to stay with her for a while, then paid for her to study abroad in France. While Louise's film career wasn't making too much progress, the public was eager for more pictures of her. She was still a young, very beautiful woman who was desired by photographers and artists to use her attractive face and figure in magazine publications. And it's not hard to see why. Aside from her fashionable haircut, she also had a sultry quality about her, especially with her eyes. In November 1927, Louise's salary rose from $250 a week to $500. However, at that same time, Paramount was leasing her out to Fox for $1,500. By 1928, Louise Brooks had become quite popular, but not so much from her movies. Her image is what really grabbed people's attention. Although she hadn't tried to become an on-screen flapper, she had been cast in that mold, though it was a rather weak mold. And the fun, energetic flapper type was generally in comedies. And while Louise was not bad at those roles, they weren't really leading anywhere. The 1928 film A Girl in Every Port did do one thing for Louise. Mostly due to her appearing in a bathing suit again, her sex appeal was solidified if it hadn't already been before. Meanwhile, her marriage was finally breaking apart. She and Eddie Sutherland had rarely lived together and spent little time together. In the midst of an affair with a laundry tycoon, George Preston Marshall, she filed for divorce. When Louise divorced Eddie Sutherland, she did so on the grounds of mental cruelty as a matter of form, but it was not a vindictive divorce. Louise was not a gold digger, and she did not demand money from Eddie in court. Eddie took it hard, however, and swallowed a bunch of pills in a half-hearted suicide attempt that failed. Louise's next film, Beggars of Life, put her in a more dramatic role again, but a much better one. Interestingly, she dressed up as a man for a portion of the film, cutting an androgynous figure 2 years before Marlene Dietrich famously did a similar thing in the film Morocco. This caused quite a bit of stir in the film magazines, though it had been done before in Hollywood. During the filming, Louise slept with a stunt double, who then tried to spread a rumor that she had a venereal disease. And this also led her to have a reputation for being loose. She was also rumored to be bisexual, though by her own account, she never went past the experimental phase with other women. These rumors were spurred on by the fact that she was close friends with some well-known lesbians as well as gay men. She humored the rumors and didn't go out of her way to deny them. The truth about her sexuality was revealed by her in later years. She said that she was not a lesbian or bisexual, and was in fact heterosexual. She was fascinated and intrigued by the female form, but not sexually attracted to it. According to her, she experimented exactly 3 times with women. One of the experiments that she confirmed was with Peppy Lederer, the niece of actress Marion Davies. At the time, Davies was in a long-term relationship with the powerful newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. Louise said that the experiment had done nothing for her. 1929 was the most decisive year of Louise Brooks's career. It started with the Canary murder case, which proved to be pretty successful. Although her character was killed off early in the film, her scenes were filled with seductive costumes and was a very memorable part of the movie. And to top it all off, her salary was raised to $750 a week. While money was never really a big issue for Louise, she did accept an offer to go to Germany to make a film for a boosted $1,000 a week with the famous director G.W. Pabst. She was sick of Hollywood and was frustrated at not getting anywhere in films. Louise claimed that B.P. Schulberg was the one who told her of Pabst's offer, the deadline of which was soon to expire. But at the same time, she said Schulberg was trying to strong-arm her into not receiving her expected raise in salary as the industry transitioned to talkies. It's an odd pairing because telling Louise of Pabst's offer would seem to undermine his motivations. According to Louise, the interaction resulting in these two big decisions lasted only about 10 minutes. If she had waited just a bit longer to make a decision, Marlene Dietrich would have gotten the role of Lulu. The search for the perfect actress for the lead role of Lulu for the film Pandora's Box had been thorough and exhausting. As Paul Falkenberg, Pabst's assistant at the time, described his role, "I talked to girls on the street, on the subway, in railway stations. Would you mind coming to my office? I would like to present you to Mr. Pabst." He looked all of them over dutifully and turned them all down, and eventually he picked Louise Brooks. Fortunately, Louise had decided quick enough and quit Paramount to move to Germany. This was very unusual for the time. Usually it was European actors and actresses moving to Hollywood, not the other way around. But Louise simply didn't care and did whatever she wanted to do. On the ship heading to Europe to work for Pabst, Louise's boyfriend, George Marshall, received a telegram from Florenz Ziegfeld that made Louise an offer to star on a Broadway show, but Marshall rejected the offer in a rather insulting way. He told Louise about it later, but she never sent a follow-up message to Ziegfeld. Another bridge had been burned. Pandora's Box is Louise's most iconic film. The role of Lulu was complex, far more so than any role in Hollywood. Lulu was seductive but reckless, setting herself up for tragedy, and Louise seemed the perfect fit. The character of Lulu was an important cultural property in Germany, and Pabst's search for precisely the right actress to play her had spanned all of Germany before he finally settled on the decidedly non-Germanic Louise. The public, the press, and the film world were divided on this new development. Some thought it unthinkable to have a Hollywood actress play one of their most beloved characters. Others were relieved that the search was finally over and ready for Pabst to do his magic with the camera. This wasn't the first time the character had been put to film, but Pabst felt that the true essence of Lulu had never been captured in that medium. Louise was greeted with fanfare in Berlin when she arrived in late 1928 after finishing filming for the Canary murder case and abruptly quitting Paramount. Being an allusion to the mythical Pandora, who unleashed all the evils of the world, it was a pretty dark role. Louise was being thrust into the world of artistic European film, which seemed to be a perfect outlet for her desire to make art instead of just entertainment. During her time filming Pandora's Box, Louise frequently came in with a hangover and delayed filming. She also claimed that she had never read a script for a movie before, and Pabst had an expensive English script made specially for her. She read a few pages, put it down, and walked away, and when she returned, it was gone. Pabst was very satisfied with her performance on film, but wasn't so taken with her attitude or private life because he thought it was interfering with her performance. Eventually, he forbade her from staying out late at night. Pabst was also not happy that Louise had brought her boyfriend, George Marshall, and was relieved when he finally left. Pabst also did not allow Louise to select her own costumes for Pandora's Box. He had very specific visions for all of her costumes and wanted them to be just right. Once he ordered that one of Louise's own dresses be dirtied and damaged in order to make her feel terrible, which she did, and thus ready, visually and mentally, for the all-important final scene of the film. Pandora's Box was not a hit upon its release in early 1929. Its depiction of prostitution and other things crossed a few borders with censors, and in America it was chopped down from its original 131 minutes to 85 minutes, changes that would certainly affect the film's message and commentary negatively. But since its release, it has been regarded as an artistic masterpiece, and Pabst has been credited with bringing out Louise's expressiveness in her acting with his techniques. For example, in the death scene of Lulu's new husband, Pabst simply told Louise to focus on the words "das Blut," the blood in German. In order to get the best expression on camera, Louise was to focus not on the emotion of seeing her dying husband, but the shock of seeing blood. But at the time, Louise's acting was criticized. It was true that she was not really a trained actor. She simply did things the way she normally would. Many interpreted this as a lack of skill. Now it is almost universally regarded as realistic, but this was the 1920s, and realistic acting was not the norm. Louise was at the peak of her career, but it was already the beginning of the end, not that she would have realized this at the time. There were two main reasons for this. First, her main connection at Paramount, Walter Wanger, had left the studio a couple of years earlier, which dissolved some of her protection from the studio bosses and higher-ups. And more importantly, while Louise was in Berlin, Paramount had begun making a sound version of the Canary murder case. All the original actors had to provide voices to add on to the silent version. After finishing filming for Pandora's Box, Louise returned to New York, where she was quickly contacted by Paramount. They had every other actor from the silent version on board, but Louise refused the $10,000 bonus, then refused further offers, eventually making it clear that she wasn't interested. The re-release of the film was a disaster for Paramount. First, they had to spend time and money finding a new actress who could fit the part, and had to do extra work to make the continuity believable. And nearly everyone was negative about Louise's voice dubbing by Margaret Livingston. Paramount had tried to hide the fact that it wasn't Louise's voice. Suspicions were raised that it was dubbed by someone else. And when the studio finally admitted that it was not Louise, it damaged the trust of the audience, and thus Paramount's reputation. Suffice it to say, they were not happy with Louise, and the studio distributed a false story saying that they had let Louise go because her voice was not good for talkies. Since talkies were quickly becoming the status quo in Hollywood, this was effectively a blacklist. This would have grave consequences for Louise Brooks in Hollywood. She would not bow to studio heads, which was an extremely bold statement, but she wouldn't realize how badly this would affect her career until about 2 years later. But before she returned to America again for good, she would make one more stab at greatness. Working with Pabst again in Germany, she would play a similar role in his next film, Diary of a Lost Girl. Though in this film, Louise played an arguably even more tragic character, who, after being taken advantage of, becomes pregnant. She has the baby, but it is taken away from her. Louise's character is then sent to a strict reform school after refusing to marry the father of the child. She escapes with her friend only to find out that her child has died. Then she becomes a prostitute, which is eventually found out by her father. It was another stellar performance by Louise and the other actors, but it had a similar fate as Pandora's Box at the box office. One of the main reasons was that, despite both films being considered artistic masterpieces now, the new novelty, talkies, was taking the world by storm, and both of these were silent. While it is still highly regarded in the present day, Diary of a Lost Girl is usually considered a step down from Pandora's Box, and this may have been due to Pabst losing interest in the project towards the end. And it can be argued that any impact of tragedy was undercut a bit by a somewhat generic ending. The unsuccessful release of these two films partially reflect the difficult transition of the film industry at that specific time. Many of the last silent films by skilled directors represented a climax of film in general, of film as an art form. But public interest moved so quickly away that, in some ways, it was almost like starting all over again. The subtleties of the great silent films were now passé. Diary of a Lost Girl was Brooks's and Pabst's last silent film. She and Pabst did not leave on the best of terms. They had been having an affair since the filming of Pandora's Box, and he wanted her to remain in Germany to hone her skills. But also, like Ruth St. Denis at the Denishawn school, Pabst grew tired of her lazy attitude, as well as the fact that she hadn't even known the plots of their two films while they were making them. During the last day of filming for Diary of a Lost Girl, Pabst lost his temper with Louise, particularly in regard to her rich American friends that she had met in Paris several weeks earlier. He thought that they were preventing her from staying in Germany and becoming a serious actress, and he told Louise, "Your life is exactly like Lulu's, and you will end the same way." After a brief return to New York in the summer of 1929, Louise received a telegram beckoning her to Paris. She discovered her immense popularity in France with surprise, considering the dampened attention in Germany. And it was here, preparing for her next film with an Italian director, that Louise Brooks ended the 1920s. I wish I could say that she ended her career on such a high note, but really, her life proceeded to be like that of her ill-fated character Lulu, just like Pabst had predicted. When she returned to Hollywood in the early 1930s, she found out that she had been cast aside due to her previous problems with Paramount. She was almost able to bypass her blacklist when she accepted an offer from director William Wellman for a role appearing alongside James Cagney, but then she changed her mind and left the project. That film was The Public Enemy, one of the most iconic movies of the 1930s. She was in 7 more films from 1931 to 1938, but they were either mediocre B films or ones where she had only a minor role. In her third-to-last film, she was an uncredited extra. In the next, her scenes were deleted. Her final film was a forgettable Western. And with that, her film career was finished. She lost her bob, now unfashionable in the Depression era, and briefly took up professional dancing again. Even though it was well received, it didn't last. Her relationship with George Marshall, who beginning in 1932 was the owner of the Washington Redskins, was tempestuous. He physically abused her at times, once even splitting her head open. Louise married a man named Deering Davis in 1936, then divorced him 6 months later. She didn't try to take any of his money either. Marshall married actress Corinne Griffith in 1938, leaving Louise feeling betrayed even though she had married another man 2 years before. The mid-1930s also saw a reunion between Louise and Pabst, this time in New York. He was trying to raise money for an ambitious film project, another film version of Faust, and he wanted Louise to star in it alongside Greta Garbo. Unfortunately, he couldn't get the funding and the project died. She returned to Wichita but was not happy there. She later said, "The citizens of Wichita either resented me for having been a success or despised me for being a failure." She opened a dancing studio, but it closed after only a year. Dancing was her original passion, not acting, and she almost certainly lamented having lost the chance to achieve her dream with Denishawn and have an extended dancing career. She played a few bit parts on radio after contacting her friend William S. Paley, but they didn't amount to much or lead anywhere. She also did some brief newspaper contributions. After World War II, she became a salesgirl at Saks Fifth Avenue in New York City. Then she worked as an escort for emergency money. Louise's fall from worldwide fashion icon to this is one of the hardest falls in film history, and it was undoubtedly an immense hit to her pride. In 1948, she decided to write an autobiographical novel, but after years of work on it, she incinerated the manuscript in 1954. Around the same time, she became a Roman Catholic and was baptized, though she would leave the church 11 years later. She wrote to her old friend William S. Paley, now one of the top executives at CBS, for financial assistance, and he immediately gave her a check for $1,000 and continued to give her a monthly check for $200 for the rest of her life. But this was on the condition that Louise produce writings, though there were no specific deadlines. Meanwhile, in France, American film preservationist James Card and French cinephile Henri Langlois were set on restoring Pandora's Box for a film exhibition in Europe. Upon its re-release, Pandora's Box finally became recognized for its true quality among mostly European film critics, 25 years too late. Louise Brooks was brought out of obscurity, even if only to a niche group. In 1956, she was persuaded by James Card to move to Rochester, New York to be close to the George Eastman House, an important film archive. There, she was able to view her surviving movies and comment on them. In these later years, Louise's reputation was revived, first in Europe, then in America, but her persecution complex often prevented her from keeping relationships. She became really attached to those trying to revive interest in her and her career, like James Card and Kenneth Tynan, only to have a dramatic break. And she even broke off her relationship with her own brother, Theo. And when Louise Brooks promised to cut off contact with someone, she kept it, permanently. She was a very suspicious person, and sometimes these suspicions were warranted, and sometimes they weren't. Some people did want to use her, but others didn't. After a trip to Europe and another trip to other places in America in the 1950s and 1960s, Louise remained reclusive in her last 25 years. This was partly due to mobility issues. She spent much of her later years in bed, afflicted with arthritis, osteoporosis in her hip, and then emphysema due to a lifelong smoking habit. And her decades of heavy drinking had not helped things. But another reason was her personality. She had a habit of getting close to people, then pushing them away at the least provocation. Most of her later acquaintances found her fascinating, but also often hard to get along with. Emotionally, she would often retreat. Louise wrote in a letter in 1964, "I don't belong anywhere, to anyone, to anything." This might just be the best, most succinct description of her. You could interpret this statement positively or negatively. She was a very unique person, for better or for worse, and was often difficult to categorize and understand. Louise Brooks's renewed popularity would continue, more or less, for the rest of her life, at least in film circles. She only occasionally allowed herself to be formally interviewed, but the most important one was in Kevin Brownlow's TV special Hollywood in 1980, alongside other surviving silent film stars. A collection of her autobiographical essays was published in 1982 called Lulu in Hollywood. After being in poor health for a while, she died of a heart attack on August 8, 1985, at the age of 78. Louise Brooks was one of the top fashion icons of the 1920s. Her stubbornness with studio bosses, hedonistic lifestyle, and promiscuity are now stuff of Hollywood legend. She struggled to be successful in Hollywood and avoid being typecast as just a silly flapper, despite never really wanting to be a movie star in the first place. But for 2 glorious films in Germany, she proved what she was capable of doing on screen, and they are her greatest legacy in film. She almost serves as an anti-example of the traditional path to stardom. She didn't try to be in the Follies. She didn't try to be in the movies. She didn't care about being famous, and she didn't care about money that much. Things just seemed to fall in her lap. She was like a magnet for people in the entertainment industry. Louise destroyed her Hollywood career, but ended up saving her legacy in the long run by deciding to go against the grain and make artistic films in Europe. This was not her original plan, but just another fascinating aspect of the life of Louise Brooks. But perhaps her greatest legacy of all are the photographs and portraits that put her beauty, style, and allure on display. She was irresistible to men and women alike. She was also often an enigmatic figure, which in some ways made her even more desirable. Her rediscovery led to the reevaluation of her career and the legends that surround her. During her career, she was sometimes called the girl in the black helmet, or more casually as Brooksy. But to her fans, she will always be known simply as Lulu. So, there you have it. Louise Brooks's life is one of the craziest rides the 1920s has to offer, and that's exactly why I chose her story as the first of the remakes of my older videos. I think that the recording quality, my narrations, and the content itself are much better put together than the original, and because if all goes well and this video can stay monetized, I can make more money to invest in future content. So if you like this video, please share it around. You'd be doing me a huge favor. It would be amazing if this remake could overshadow the original because I think it's a much better representation of this channel. But since the original still gets quite a few views, I might not remove it right away, but at some point I might private it so that I'm not competing against myself for views. I know a lot of people might be attached to that original video, but I truly believe that this one is much better, so I hope everyone will hear me out on that. But anyways, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I definitely have an idea of what my next remake will be, so hopefully that will be finished later this year, but I'll let you guys know more about that later. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.